Loving someone is one thing. Standing beside them through everything, that is something else entirely. When Kasyoka married Pastor Kento, she thought she understood what she was stepping into. She had watched him lead. She had seen how he carried people. She had admired from a careful distance the quiet weight of the calling on his life. She thought she was ready. And in many ways, she was. But there are some things you cannot understand until you are living them, until the ministry is no longer something you admire from across the room, but something you carry with both hands, every day, beside the person you love. This is part 2 of Kasyoka and Kento's story. Not the beginning. The real thing. The part that happens after the wedding. The part that tests what you are made of. And the part that, if you let it, makes you into someone far greater than you ever imagined you could be. When Kasyoka married Pastor Kento, she thought she understood what life as a pastor's wife would be like. She imagined helping organize church events, welcoming newcomers, and supporting her husband as he led the congregation. She knew it would involve service, sacrifice, prayer. But there were parts of the journey she could never have imagined. Because loving a pastor was one thing. Standing beside him when ministry became heavy was another. And Japan would soon teach her lessons about faith she had never expected to learn. 6 months after their wedding, Kasyoka was still adjusting to the rhythm of married life in Japan. Their apartment was small but warm, tucked into a quiet neighborhood just a few train stops from the church. Every morning, Kento woke early to prepare sermons or respond to messages from church members. Sometimes Kasyoka would wake up and find him already sitting at the small dining table with his Bible open. "Good morning," he would say gently when she walked into the room. "Morning, Pastor," she would tease. Kento would laugh softly. "You promised you wouldn't call me that at home." "I married a pastor," she would reply. "I have to remind you sometimes." Their mornings were peaceful. But church life was rarely quiet. One Sunday after service, a woman from the congregation approached Kasyoka with tears in her eyes. "Can I talk to you?" she asked softly. Kasyoka nodded immediately. They stepped into a small prayer room. The woman explained that her marriage was falling apart. Her husband had stopped coming to church. Arguments had become constant. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face. Kasyoka listened carefully. Then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She prayed with her. Later that evening, as Kasyoka and Kento walked home, she said quietly, "I didn't realize how much pain people carry." Kento nodded slowly. "That's part of ministry." Kasyoka glanced at him. "Does it ever feel heavy?" He smiled gently. "Sometimes." Then he squeezed her hand. "But that's why God never intended pastors to stand alone." Being a pastor's wife in Japan also came with cultural challenges Kasyoka hadn't expected. Most members of the church were foreigners, but many local Japanese visitors came occasionally out of curiosity. Some were shy. Others were cautious about Christianity. Kasyoka sometimes worried about saying the wrong thing. One afternoon after Bible study, she confessed her concern to Kento. "I'm not Japanese," she said. "I don't want to accidentally offend someone." Kento smiled reassuringly. "You don't have to be Japanese." "What do you mean? You just have to be yourself," he said. Kindness translates in every culture. That advice became her anchor. But there was another challenge no one had warned her about: loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from always being seen. People often watched the pastor's wife closely. How she spoke, how she dressed, how she handled difficult moments. Kasyoka sometimes felt pressure to always appear strong. One night after a long church meeting, she sat quietly on the couch. Kento noticed her silence. "What's wrong?" he asked. Kasyoka hesitated, then she spoke honestly. "Sometimes I feel like I have to be perfect." Kento immediately shook his head. "You don't, but people expect." He gently interrupted. "Kasyoka." She looked up. "You don't have to be a perfect pastor's wife. You just have to be the woman God called." A year later, the church faced its biggest challenge yet. the building they rented suddenly increased its rental price dramatically, so high that the church could no longer afford it. When Kento shared the news with the leadership team, the room fell silent. "What will we do?" someone asked. Kento sighed quietly. "We pray." But as they walked home that night, Kasyoka could see the weight on his shoulders. "You're worried," she said softly. Kento nodded. "I don't want the church to lose its home." Kasyoka stopped walking. Then she took his hands. "Then we pray together." Right there under the streetlights, they bowed their heads and asked God for guidance. 2 weeks later, something surprising happened. A member of the church approached Kento after service. "I heard about the building situation," he said. "My company owns an office space that isn't being used on weekends." Kento blinked. "You mean? You can use it for church services?" The rent was half the price of their current location. That Sunday evening, Kasyoka sat quietly in the new space as chairs were arranged. She looked around the room, then smiled softly. "God really does answer prayers." Kento squeezed her hand. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes in ways we never expect." A few weeks after the church moved into their new worship space, life began settling into a calmer rhythm. The congregation was relieved. Kento was sleeping better, and Kasyoka finally felt like she could breathe again. But one quiet evening, as she sat alone in their apartment after work, Kasyoka noticed something strange. For several days, she had been unusually tired. At first, she assumed it was simply the stress of the church transition. But something in the back of her mind whispered another possibility. She walked to the small pharmacy near their building and bought a pregnancy test. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat in the bathroom waiting for the result. 3 minutes later, she stared down at the small white stick. 2 pink lines. Kasyoka blinked, then blinked again. "Lord," she whispered softly. A slow smile spread across her face. "We're having a baby." That evening, Kento returned home later than usual after meeting with church leaders. When he walked into the apartment, Kasyoka was sitting at the dining table. There was a small box in front of her. He looked confused. "What's this?" Kasyoka tried to contain her smile. "Open it." Kento lifted the lid. Inside was a tiny pair of baby socks. For a moment, he didn't react. Then realization hit him all at once. His eyes widened. He looked up slowly. "Kasyoka." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "We're going to be parents." Kento covered his mouth with his hand. Then he laughed in disbelief. "You're serious?" Kasyoka laughed too. "Yes." Kento walked around the table and wrapped her in a tight embrace. For a long moment they simply held each other. Then he whispered, "Thank you, God." Pregnancy brought a new kind of joy into their lives, but it also introduced new challenges. Kasyoka was still deeply involved in the church. She helped organize fellowship events. She welcomed new visitors. She coordinated volunteers. But as her pregnancy progressed, she began to feel physically exhausted. One Sunday afternoon after service, she sat quietly in a chair while others cleaned the room. Kento noticed immediately. "You should go home and rest," he said gently. "I'm fine," she insisted. But Kento shook his head. "Kasyoka." She sighed. "Okay, maybe a little tired." He smiled softly. "You're carrying 2 lives right now." She laughed. "That makes it sound dramatic." "It is dramatic," he said. "It's a miracle." At the same time, the church was entering a new season of growth. More international students were attending services. Young professionals from different countries had begun visiting regularly. Some Sundays, the small rented space was nearly full, which meant more responsibilities, more counseling, more planning, more pressure on Kento. One evening, Kasyoka woke up at midnight and noticed the bed beside her was empty. She walked into the living room. Kento sat at the table with his laptop open and his Bible beside him. "You're still awake?" she asked softly. Kento looked up. "Oh, did I wake you?" She shook her head. "Come to bed," he sighed. I just need to finish preparing Sunday's message. Kasyoka studied his tired face. Have you slept properly this week? He hesitated. Mostly. She raised an eyebrow. Kento. He smiled sheepishly. Maybe not. Kasyoka walked over and closed his laptop gently. That sermon will still be there tomorrow. But the church will survive if their pastor sleeps. He chuckled. Fair point. Despite the joy of the growing church, Kento carried a silent burden. One evening after Bible study ended, the last church members left the building. Kento sat alone in the empty room. Kasyoka noticed his quiet mood. What's wrong? She asked. Kento hesitated. Then he spoke honestly. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough. Kasyoka frowned slightly. What do you mean? There are so many needs, he said. So many people looking for guidance. He looked around the empty room. What if I fail them? Kasyoka walked over and sat beside him. Then she took his hand. Kento, you're not responsible for fixing everyone's life. But as their pastor, you're responsible for pointing them to God, she said gently. That's all. Kento looked at her thoughtfully. And what if that isn't enough? Kasyoka smiled softly. It always has been. Just when things seemed to be going well, a difficult situation arose. Two church leaders had a serious disagreement. What began as a simple difference of opinion turned into a conflict that divided several members of the congregation. Voices were raised. Meetings became tense. Kento found himself caught in the middle. One evening he returned home looking completely drained. Kasyoka immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? Kento sank into a chair. The leadership team is fighting. About what? Everything. He rubbed his forehead. They're angry with each other. Kasyoka sat beside him. That must be hard. Kento sighed. I hate conflict. She nodded. But sometimes, conflict reveals what needs healing. The next week, Kasyoka surprised even herself. During a meeting between the leaders, she spoke up. Not forcefully, but calmly. We all came to this church because we love God, she said. And because we love this community. The room fell silent. But if we allow pride to divide us, she continued, then we lose what makes this church special. Her words softened the tension. Slowly, the conversation shifted. Apologies were exchanged, and the situation began to heal. Later that night, as they walked home, Kento looked at her with admiration. You were incredible today. Kasyoka laughed. I was terrified. Kasyoka was 8 months pregnant when the phone call came. It was late in the evening, and she and Kento had just finished dinner. Kento glanced at his phone and frowned slightly. It's Mr. Nakamura, he said. Mr. Nakamura was the building manager of the office space they used for church services, Kento answered. Kasyoka watched his expression slowly change as he listened. At first, he looked confused, then concerned. Finally, quiet. When the call ended, he set the phone down slowly. What happened? Kasyoka asked. Kento took a deep breath. The company is selling the building. Kasyoka blinked. So, what does that mean? It means the new owners might not allow us to keep using the space. Silence filled the room. For the second time in 2 years, the church might lose its home. Kasyoka rested her hands on her stomach. The baby shifted gently. Okay, she said softly. We've been here before. Over the next few weeks, Kento worked tirelessly trying to find a solution. He contacted other churches, community centers, rental halls. But most spaces were either unavailable or far too expensive. Each night, he returned home more exhausted. Kasyoka watched him carefully. One evening, she finally said what had been on her mind. Kento. He looked up from his laptop. Yes? You can't carry this alone. I'm the pastor, he replied quietly. That's part of the job. Kasyoka shook her head. No. She reached across the table and took his hand. You're the pastor, but you're also a husband. And soon, you'll be a father. Her voice softened. You need help. Kento sighed. I just don't want to disappoint the church." Kasyoka smiled gently. Faith was never about control. It's about trust. The following Sunday, Kento shared the situation with the congregation. Instead of panic, something unexpected happened. People began praying, right there in the room. Some prayed quietly. Others prayed aloud. Different accents, different languages. One church, one request. "Lord, guide us." Kasyoka sat in the front row, hands on her stomach. As she listened to the prayers rising around her, something stirred in her heart. This church wasn't just a building. It was a family. The next week felt endless. There was still no clear solution. Meanwhile, Kasyoka's due date was approaching quickly. One evening, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen. She froze. "Kento," she said slowly, "I think the baby might be coming." Kento stared at her. "Now?" Kasyoka nodded. "Yes." Within minutes, they were rushing to the hospital. Kento's heart pounded as they arrived. He held her hand tightly through every moment. Hours later, just before sunrise, their baby was born. A tiny boy. His cry filled the quiet hospital room. Kento stared at the child in amazement. Kasyoka laughed softly despite her exhaustion. "You look shocked." "I am," he admitted. Then he whispered, "Hello, little one." Holding their son changed something inside Kento. As he watched the tiny baby sleeping peacefully beside Kasyoka, the worries about the church suddenly felt different. Not smaller, but clearer. He realized something. The church had never truly depended on him. It depended on God. Later that day, he sat beside Kasyoka's bed. "I've been trying to solve everything myself," he said quietly. Kasyoka smiled. "You finally noticed?" 2 weeks later, while Kasyoka and the baby were resting at home, Kento received an email. It was from a Japanese Christian organization. They had heard about the international church through a member. The message was simple. They owned a small building that had once been used for ministry but had been empty for several years. If the church wanted it, they could rent it for a very small amount. Kento stared at the message in disbelief. He read it again. Then again. Finally, he called Kasyoka from the living room. "You need to see this." She read the email slowly, then looked up with wide eyes. "Kento." He nodded. "I think God just gave the church a home." 3 months later, the congregation gathered in their new building for the first time. It wasn't large, but it was theirs. Members helped paint the walls. Others donated chairs and equipment. Slowly, the empty space became a welcoming church. Kasyoka stood near the entrance holding their baby while people greeted one another. A woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "You and Pastor K have changed my life," she said softly. Kasyoka smiled. "We didn't change it. God did." Sometimes, the life we fear most becomes the life that shapes us into who we were meant to be. Kasyoka looked around at the walls that had been painted by hands that loved this church, at the chairs that had been donated by people who had believed when there was nothing yet to believe in, at the life she was living, the life she had once looked at from across a room and thought, "I am not the woman for that." Kasyoka once believed she could never carry the responsibilities of a pastor's wife, but through challenges, prayers, and unexpected blessings, she discovered something beautiful. Being a pastor's wife wasn't about being perfect. It was about standing beside the person God called you to love, through every season, through every struggle, through every miracle. She thought about the girl in Kenya who had laughed and shaken her head. "I could never marry a pastor." She smiled softly. That girl had not been wrong, exactly. She simply had not yet become the woman she was going to be. That evening, after the first service in the new building ended, Kasyoka and Kento sat alone in the sanctuary. Their baby slept peacefully in his carrier. The building was quiet, small, theirs. Kento looked around the room. "I still can't believe this happened." Kasyoka laughed softly. "You doubted God. I didn't doubt him, he said. I just worried. She nudged his shoulder. That's the same thing. They both laughed. Then Kento looked at her thoughtfully. You know something? What? You've become an incredible pastor's wife. Kasyoka raised an eyebrow. Really? Yes. She smiled gently. That's funny. Why? Because I spent most of my life saying I would never marry a pastor. Kento chuckled. And now? She looked around the room, at the baby sleeping peacefully beside them, and finally back at her husband. Now, she said softly, I can't imagine my life any other way. Outside, the streets of Japan were quiet. The city carried on as it always had, unhurried, ordered, beautiful. And inside a small church that had nearly been lost twice and had been found twice by the faithfulness of God, two people sat in the stillness together, grateful, full, and ready for whatever came next, because sometimes the life you fear most is the one that was always yours. Kasyoka once said she could never be a pastor's wife, and then God placed her exactly there, in the middle of a ministry, a marriage, a church that needed her, and a life that shaped her into more than she ever thought she could be. If you're walking through a heavy season right now, in ministry, in marriage, or in faith, this story was for you. God has not forgotten where you are. Subscribe to Written by Grace, Faith and Forever Stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear that God is still faithful in the hard chapters. And remember, the life you fear most might be exactly the one you were made for.